Today we'll be discussing Louis C.K. and the new documentary, Sorry, Not Sorry. And we'll be discussing hair transplants. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we'll be discussing the new documentary that's out now about Louis C.K. entitled Sorry, Not Sorry. And then we'll be discussing hair transplants. So let's get this first part out of the way first. Louis C.K. has not had a hair transplant. We were trying to think of a topic to pair with Louis C.K. Maybe he should have one. We can perhaps suggest that to him. He may want to do that. We're going to talk about Louis C.K., this documentary, a lot of the controversies around Louis C.K. And I don't know, Ali, I must admit, this is the third episode that we've done in the past few months about this concept of, how can you like the art and not the artist? We talked about Michael Jackson. Now we're talking about Louis C.K. This is probably the last one of these types of episodes, and it's revisiting a lot of these issues, especially around Louis C.K., so we thought it would be appropriate to discuss today. What do you think of that, Ali? Is that a good summary?
It is. I'm still worried about how you're hinting that I should get a hair transplant by coming up with this hair transplant.
We're going to talk about that in our second half, but right now, let's talk about Louis C.K. and Sorry, Not Sorry.
So first off, I believe it's $4.99 on iTunes, or if you're looking for a deal and you don't care for Apple, $3.99 on YouTube.
Oh, so that's the first thing. I paid $4.99 on Apple.
I'm sorry, buddy. I found that out later after you told me about it. Because I wanted to watch it on TV and not on my laptop. That wasn't really an option. I mean, it is, but you need your Apple TV subscription, which we have put on pause for a little while. They bumped up their price by about 60%. I was like, okay.
But Ali, you know that I got us access to Apple TV like screeners for free. So you can just log in and watch these screeners.
Information I could have used a couple of days ago. Anyway, watched it on my laptop. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to tell you the whole bigger thing that's in my mind and how it ends. There will be spoilers, I think it's safe to say. I mean, they're not covering any ground that hasn't already been covered about Louis C.K., so it's sort of spoilers in quotes, but it is a very interesting documentary from a number of different angles. I'm going to say this. So Louis C.K., who was Louis C.K.? To me personally, I thought he was an absolute master of the game. He was... The key to comedy is making it look like you just got up and sort of had these thoughts. And it takes so much work to make it look so effortless. This is the irony there. And he had done the work and he really made it look effortless. Many people started doing comedy because Louis C.K. made it feel like such like an accessible thing and got a real shock when it was like, oh, that's not that easy. How does Louis do that? Well, it's the hours he put in, obviously. Yeah. His shows were groundbreaking in a number of different ways, and his approach to the industry from a financial perspective was very interesting. It's like the world has now caught up to the Louis C.K. model, but when it was like between 2012, 2014, I remember this. I remember everybody's trying to charge, $15, $20 for their comedy special. And he's like, I'm just charging $5. I don't need more than $5 from everybody. Now, of course, you don't, Louis C.K., because you have millions of fans. And I remember thinking, this is going to piss a lot of people off. Because now how does Aziz Ansari charge, or whoever, I'm just putting out a name, charge $20? And fans are like, well, Louis is $5. And I think a lot of people were probably like, he's bringing the whole price for everybody down. And I remember that distinctly. It didn't affect me one way or another at the time, but I was definitely aware of how that was going to bother people. Because I've worked in this industry where, I MC a ton. And there was a time where, let's say somebody comes to town and it's a 500-person show and they're looking for an MC, and I didn't really have any name of any kind, but I still had some MC chops. I would say, well, $1 a head from your tickets should go to the MC. It's a 500-seater. $500. And then other people would be like, yeah, it's fine. I'll just do it for $100. And some of the people who do it for $100, they were like doing tons of acting and commercials and whatever else. One guy was like a hand model making tons of money. So he's like, yeah, who cares? It's a good, fun Friday night for $100. But what you're doing is you're lowering what we can
Right,
all
right.
command in a city, in an industry. And so I remember that about Louis C.K. But anyway, again, I don't want to sing his praises too much. That's not what this is about. But certainly I held him
Yeah.
in very high regard.
So we
Yeah.
should talk a bit about it because at the time where these things happened and came to light, these allegations, which he actually admits are true, so I guess they're not allegations, he was probably the biggest comic, in North America or the world. So let's talk a bit about him just to situate where we are with him. So his real name is Louis Alfred Sikely, so I think that's where the CK comes from. And he's actually lived in Mexico for a long time, and his first language is Spanish, which I didn't know that. His father's
What
half
the?
Mexican. Yep, it's true. And he only began to learn English when he was 7, when he moved back to the U.S. Isn't that weird?
That certainly doesn't come up in the
No.
comedy.
He says he hardly has
Oh
any
my God.
Spanish anymore. And then he started doing open mics in like the mid 80s. Apparently, he went on and he had 5 minutes, but he only had 2 minutes of material. That was the first time he went on, and he was so embarrassing. He didn't do comedy again for 2 years. And then, of course, he was in Boston, and Boston has a big comedy scene, and eventually started to opening for people like Dennis Leary, eventually Jerry Seinfeld. Then he got kind of into writing, and he wrote for Conan O'Brien. He wrote for The Late Show with David Letterman. He was the head writer for the Dana Carvey Show. So people may not remember this. It's actually kind of like a cult classic now. There's only, I think, 11 episodes. But here...
They show a little clip of Dana Carvey and Steve Carell together in a thing, and then they show another clip and it's Steve Carell again. So this is like
Steve
early...
Carell, Stephen Colbert, Robert Smigel,
Yes.
who people know as Triumph the Insult Comic Dog, Charlie Kaufman, right, the director, right, who directed Adaptation and Being John Malkovich. I mean, it was amazing. So we should probably do this as an episode, Ali, is rewatch those 11 episodes and then kind of come back and talk about it. And it was canceled, I think, after the first episode almost, because, I mean, it wasn't, but it was basically the nails
cancel culture. Am I right, Asif?
Well, because what he did was he played Bill Clinton in the opening scene. I remember watching it very clearly, and he was like breastfeeding, like Bill Clinton was like breastfeeding. I don't even know what the joke was, but like it was like pretty controversial for like this was like the 90s, right? And then he wrote for the Chris Rock show because Louis C.K. Very good friends with Chris Rock, and then he kind of ascended then in the 90s and 2000s, right? And as you're saying, his comedy was great. I was a huge fan. And then he created Louie, which was this FX show. I've seen every episode. My wife and I used to watch it. And it was a very good show because it was kind of dramatic, kind of avant-garde, abstract, dramatic, funny. It was just really well done. And he won a couple Emmys for writing with that. And then...
I thought he could have won for acting as well.
Yeah.
I thought the acting at that I mean...
I thought he
Louis
was great.
C.K.'s acting is rarely talked about, but it was very, very strong.
Yeah, it was
incredible.
Great. And he then became a producer. He produced Baskets. Did you watch Baskets?
I did.
I never watched
Baskets.
it. You liked it?
Okay. Yeah, of course, man. Louis Anderson, Zach Galifianakis, what is not to like? They are also phenomenal actors, both of them, putting in like their best performances in that show.
Pamela Adlon did Better Things. She was also on Louis. And then he had this web series. This was the last kind of major thing he did, which was Horace and Pete. It's him and Steve Buscemi. They co-own a bar. It's basically like a sad Cheers. That's not really what it is. It's
a little too sad for my liking. I never fully understood what was happening in that show.
So I watched the whole thing with my wife. I really liked it. This is one we also had to pay per episode, just download them from his website, which I did. Had Edie Falco, Alan Alda, Stephen Wright, Jessica Lange. It was a very, very well done show. And then, of course, at the same time, he was doing what you were saying. Ali is releasing his specials on his website. Again, this is like the whole Patreon kind of culture that we do now, or podcasts and comedy specials. But it was a unique thing back then because we're talking like as you said, the 2010s when he was doing this. And then basically there was this controversy that came out around the same time that Horace and Pete came out, which is one of the reasons why it wasn't as acclaimed as maybe it should have been. It didn't win awards and stuff like that because this controversy came out around that time. And so that's what this documentary focuses on. This documentary, Sorry Not Sorry, is produced by the New York Times, and the original story came out in the New York Times, even though, as the documentary says, other people had published stuff about this in the past, but they were kind of, railroaded and even blacklisted. The people who were trying to, especially people from the comedy community, women from the comedy community who were trying to write about this, were kind of like just shoved to the side. So what is this controversy? Again, like, it's hard to call it controversy because he admits that he did this. He basically, with only women, of course, and often women who he had some sort of power relationship over. So sometimes it was at work when he was working on some of his shows. Sometimes it was, comics who were kind of meeting up with him to discuss projects or for advice or after
Comedy festival, the Aspen
festivals.
Comedy Festival.
Yeah. And he would basically, he says he asked permission beforehand, but again, even he admits that, you're putting people in a predicament when you have a position of power and you're asking permission to do something like this, which is masturbate in front of them. And that's basically what he did. And this was, I guess, a poorly kept secret, Ali, in comedy up until this point.
It was, I actually remember as these things were circulating before this big New York Times expose, there was a Gawker article in 2012 about a famous comedian who likes to jerk off.
Yeah, it was like a blind item. Is that what that was? Yeah.
Exactly right. And it got lost in the full. But I remember that was the first signs that this is going to be a pretty blockbuster thing at one point. And even then, people are like, okay, they're saying it might be Louis C.K. But, I count myself as one of his legions of, one of his fans among the legion of his fans at that time. And I certainly didn't want to admit that. I wasn't sitting around waiting for this man to crumble. I wasn't expecting or hoping for his demise, quite the opposite. So I sort of put that way back at the back of my brain. I was like, that's okay. I don't think that's true. It's probably not true. And that's how I proceeded, like many people.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people ignored it at the time until this came out. And then the documentary focuses on the rise of Louis C.K., then about these interactions he had with a lot of these women, and then this coming out. But then it's really, the point of this documentary is the title, Sorry Not Sorry. So he kind of apologized in this response that he wrote that was also published, basically admitted to what he did, said he put these people in an awkward position. He needs to take time to just listen and not talk so much. And then about 8 or 9 months later, was back up doing comedy. And with really not a lot of communication after that, And the documentary, it is a bit of a just kind of going over the facts of this case. And if you've read anything about this, you probably would have already known a lot of these things that are there. What I do like about the documentary, Ali, is that it really gives these female comics, most of them are comics, who were, who had this done to them, a voice. And even some people who maybe it didn't quite happen to, but also like Tig Notaro, and it gives them a voice, right?
Yeah, I mean, it also, we have a little clip from Matt Damon, Mike Schur, who, created The Office and Parks and Rec and all this. We have Joe Rogan talking about this as well. But yeah, definitely, it is great to get the perspective from some of these women. And I thought that was the most honest thing about this. Like Jen Kirkman, for example, saying herself, why am I still talking about this? And she's like, I would love not to. But when she says something like that, you immediately think about the hypocrisy when it comes to men, because men can continue talking about something from when they were a child that is meaningless, like nothing. Oh, I used to wet my bed or whatever. And you can have that as part of your act for 30 years. And something that was, if not traumatic, borderline traumatic, and certainly upsetting to Jen Kirkman. There's judgment around why does she keep talking about this? So the double standard and the hypocrisy was on display the entire time. And Mike Schur, to his credit, says, okay, I've heard these things, because Louis C.K. came on Parks and Rec a couple of times. And he was like, okay, that's really not my problem,
Mm-hmm.
is what he thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that they keep that in because that's what many people would have thought. And then I love that he had his own sort of reckoning about that. It's precisely because of people like me saying that it's not my problem is why this is a
Yeah,
problem, because
exactly.
we continue to shelter men who are
Right.
committing these type of crimes. Not a crime, yep, that's fine, but these type of behaviors, we just sweep them under the rug
Yeah.
and be like, oh, it's okay, it's fine.
And really, the documentary really it makes its point and picks up steam in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 minutes of the documentary. A couple things that came out in some interviews afterwards with the filmmakers, and I'll link to these. They said they approached every major comedian, and especially female comedians, and nobody wanted to talk about it. And so they're like, that in itself says something, right? Like,
Sure. And just to give a timeline, right? 2005, Megan Coster is one of the women in this documentary, says that this was an open secret.
mhm,
Okay. This is what he did. Everybody knew about it. Women comedians would talk about it. That's
mhm,
2005. And so he'd been doing it prior to 2005. 2012 is when the Gawker article came out about a famous comedian, not named,
mhm.
right? So that's quite a few years. That's at least a decade. So, yes, 5 women talked about it. It would be, I don't know. I would guess it's like almost triple digits. I mean, this guy's
Right.
clearly this is something he would
Because
do.
as the women in the documentary point out, you come out, and say this, there are perceived few repercussions. We'll talk about that in a second. And as Jenna Kirkman says, now she's linked to this, and everybody wants to ask her about this in every interview. And she's like, what the hell? Like, it's really unfortunate. And people will say that the industry has tons of toxic behavior. You tell me if that's true or not, Ali. And then women who call it out will then suffer career ending or damaging backlash because it's still a male dominated industry. So I don't know. That's my opinion and what other people have written. But what do you think about those statements?
Of course, Jen Kirkman was, I think, 3 specials later. She was trying to do press for her special. 3 specials since this big sort of Louis revelation, and trying to do press. And I guess her publicist was probably like, we don't want to talk about the Louis thing. And so then, press outlets were like, oh, if she doesn't want to talk about the Louis thing, we don't want to do the interview. Like, what is that? You can't move on with your life? She is the recipient / victim of awful behavior. Why does she need to keep talking about it? So this is her thing. She's like, I don't want to talk about it. I'd love to live the rest of my life never thinking about this again. But of course, that's, this is what people need to hear about this somehow for some reason. But
And there's some interesting other points that are made in some of the other articles I read about this. So someone says this isn't a matter of separating the art from the artist. It's a matter of separating a threat from the workplace, because comedy is a job. You go to a place of employment and you do work and then you leave, right? And then if someone did this in any other environment, and just to be clear, Louis C.K. didn't just do this in the privacy of his own hotel or apartment or whatever. He's done this on the phone with people in workplace environments. No other, I think they mentioned this documentary, no other work environment would allow this to happen, right? Someone would be fired immediately, not back to work 9 months later, right?
Yeah, there was one of the New York Times reporters says this, which I thought was which was a false equivalency in a way. She says, this is Melina, I can't remember her last name, a reporter named Melina. She had this example where what if you worked in a bank and you're a regional manager and then another regional manager said to you, can I jerk off in front of you? I think that's a false equivalency because Louis C.K. is the regional manager in this situation and the rest of the people are younger, sometimes, ambitious people who want to become managers one day, right? That's the important part of all this. For me, anyway, I think people needed to hear more of an apology for him because of the power dynamics here. The power dynamics is the whole issue. Otherwise, he would have been ratted out probably a decade earlier. right? It's because he was viewed as this genius comedian that everybody wants to work with. There's this one moment where somebody stands up at a live event, some young person. This is why the young people are the ones, like, this is where the young people, the best, stands up and talks to Jon Stewart and says, you work with, Louis C.K., who's been accused of this. And John was like, no, I don't. You know who I am, right? I would know about that and this kind of thing. And I believe Jon Stewart generally didn't know about it, but his condescension towards that young kid does not age very well. It was a little bit unfortunate to see, but of course, John has since gone on to talk about his own deep disappointment in Louis C.K. But it's very interesting. Let me ask you this, Asif. There's a moment where Matt Damon says, Louis C.K. said, okay, what everyone is saying is true. And Matt Damon goes, okay, so we can work with that. Like, what the hell else do you want to hear from someone?
Yeah, exactly. And so that is, I think, he made the first step. And Wesley Morris, who's one of the New York Times, I think he's a film critic mainly, but he also writes other things for the New York Times. He's in the documentary and he says, when you apologize for something, you need to specify what you're apologizing for. And I'm not sure that he ever did this. And, just saying, yeah, I did this, and then basically just going back to work afterwards, I'm not quite sure that makes a lot of sense. And so, well, let's talk about this, because then he basically, like I said, went back to performing stand-up. And his first set, he didn't even mention this before. And then lots of people criticized him going back to work, including Judd Apatow, some other people. But other people like Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock, Bill Burr, Janine Garofalo, Sarah Silverman, Joe Rogan, they supported his right to continue to do stand-up. And basically what a lot of the promoters say, so in the documentary, is the owner of the Comedy Cellar in New York City. That's the comedy bar that you see Louis C.K. walking into at the beginning of the TV show Louis.
Mm-hmm. And it's a comedy mecca in the United States.
You've definitely seen people performing there and filmed, for sure.
Yeah. Did we do an episode on white men and their apologies and how it's like a masterclass in the worst way to apologize?
Certainly, we've talked about it before. We didn't do a full episode.
We've talked about that. We've also talked about this idea of cancel culture and, this documentary could also be called Cancel Culture is Nothing. It doesn't exist. And it's very funny. I don't know. The benefit of me watching on my laptop was I could also pause at certain moments because they have quick, usually, let's say, Vulture, Gawker, New York Times, they have headlines that flash. Mm-hmm. And so you see, I have memories of this. I have memories of talking to you about this. Comments by Steve Harvey and Rowan Atkinson about, cancel culture is changing. Two people who have done nothing edgy in their entire lives. Steve Harvey, just focus on reading things correctly at award shows. That's all you got to worry about. And they're like, oh, cancel culture is doing this. I mean, cancel culture, what an incredible joke. And of course, the other point was that, he got canceled, people say, and then he did his time. What else do you want from the guy? 9 months? That's not.
I mean, like I said, I'm not sure that there's a time that has to be associated with it. But again, if you regret what you did and you actually show remorse, but as you said, these apologies are nothing. These are nothing things. And then people don't care because they interview people going into his comedy shows at the end of the documentary. And they're like, oh, you know what? It's okay. And, some people, there are some really good quotes. So one guy says, everybody, has a certain level of hypocrisy in their lives. And this is my hypocrisy. This is someone attending his show. And I'm like, that is a very insightful comment because that is true. And Mike Schur, as you mentioned from Parks and Rec, who's interviewed in the documentary, he says, where do you draw the line? And you have to draw it somewhere and you have to take a stand somewhere. And Mike Schur has, but that patron who's watching the thing, he also drew his line differently. And he's like, yeah, of course, this guy who's going to the comedy show is like, yeah, of course, I'm not for people either sexually assaulting people or abusing their power in these kind of relationships. But yet he's there at the show. So,
well, Asif, I'll tell you that this is the biggest point of this documentary from a micro and a macro thing. So you're just getting back to what you said. Yeah, as Megan Koster says, he came back, he learned nothing. He didn't say anything profound, right? One of the reporters, Wesley, what's his
Wesley
last name? I can't
Morris.
remember. Wesley Morris says, we loved Louis C.K. for his honesty, right? And then him not addressing his issues honestly is the opposite of what made him famous and made him like him. So I think that's where I stood too, like just a deep disappointment in this person as a human being. That's the issue. I don't think he should be destitute and never work again either. But I do think that, as Michael Ian Black says, this guy just comes out with a big middle finger to everybody. But who are you mad at? Like, the woke liberals, cancel culture, what are you mad at? Like, you should only be mad at yourself.
Right. Because then, by definition, you're mad at the women, which doesn't make any sense. What? What are you talking about? So I really do like these quotes at the end of the movie, as you said, from Michael Ian Black and Wesley Morris, because I think they really hit the nail on the head. Wesley Morris was basically saying artists want it both ways. As you said, they want to be honest. Yeah, you're seeing the real me. Well, then let's hear about how you really felt when you abused these women, which is basically what you did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have a sit down with some of these women and have a talk. That would be the most compelling thing I could see. And Mike Schur, this idea of where do you draw the line? I sometimes want to draw the line on the New York Times. I subscribe to the New York Times. They are, as far as a media outlet goes, in news, they are absolute cowards. They are, they help the rise of Donald Trump. Their reporting in the Middle East is full of complete cowardice. I work for a media organization, CBC, deeply disappointing news reporting in so many different ways. Where do you draw the line? Right now, New York Times also has these incredible documentaries. They have like these very insightful, workaholic investigative journalists that work for them that do incredible work. And the same thing on the CBC. You have amazing, amazing shows. But many people would be like, no, I'm cutting off mainstream media because they are the problem with everything. So this is why I say micro and macro. As I'm watching it, I'm thinking about this also. Every month, minimum 3 times, I think about canceling my New York Times membership. But
well,
here we are.
I was wondering that when I watched the documentary. I do like it. I think especially if you don't know a lot about this, and especially if you want to hear some of these female voices, which you have not heard a lot about, I think you should consider watching it. I did feel it was a bit of a, ad for the New York Times in a sense. Lots of people from the New York Times are commenting on it. A lot of the people who wrote the initial article. And it'd be nice to hear some other viewpoints. But to be fair, like I said, the creators afterwards in interviews have said, we tried to get other people on the record for this and nobody else wanted to. So it is a bit of a limitation.
Including Louis C.K.
Yeah. And so, I think we'll leave it with this. There's an article, which I'll link to, which interviews a bunch of female comedians. This is from 2019, Wanda Sykes, Carmen Esposito, and a few others, for those of you who know these comedians. So Carmen Esposito, in this article, it's in the Hollywood Reporter, basically says, not only is Louis C.K. by coming back so early, all the controversy and problems with that, maybe you should be stepping aside and allowing some comedians, perhaps female comedians, to come up and take the stage. Maybe that's what you could do, right? You could, do a show and promote only female comics or something like that, right? But you're just like going back to your spot in line and pushing everybody else down. Interesting. Wanda Sykes, who I have a lot of respect for, she kind of summarized like this, and maybe this is where we should end this. She says, listen, the ultimate decision is up to the audiences. And this is kind of what those club promoters say. If he shows up, everybody sits there and claps and listens and laughs, then maybe it's time for him to come back. If the audience says, no, it's too soon, what are you doing here? And then they complain and people walk out, then you go, it's too soon.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about a subject that is, you'd think, near and dear to my heart, hair transplants, given that I look like what I look like, which is very bald. Not near and dear to my heart. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm very angry that hair transplants are something that we're talking about. You're telling me with all the technology we have, there can't be some little, cream or solution. I'd even accept a potion that you just sprinkle on my scalp and my hair comes back. You're telling me that doesn't exist? The military has it, the medical community has it, and you're keeping that information from us, Asif, and I resent you. But today we are going to talk about hair transplants. The questions basically, first of all, how common is baldness? Because that's the first question And then we can find out how many men need to address their baldness. I can answer that anecdotally.
Okay, let's get started. So hair loss occurs in about 60% of men. So a lot. And of course, I still have a luscious head of hair, but now that I've said that, I'll probably start losing it soon.
I see it falling out right now.
Oh
I saw a
boy.
couple of hairs just fall out as you said it.
But 10% of women will have hair loss. And again, sometimes it's medication or they have other medical conditions like lupus, for example, can cause it. We did a whole episode on alopecia. We remember we did that with the old Chris Rock
Connected to
slap.
Chris Rocks, I do remember. Thank you.
But you guys can go check that out in our archive. So we'll talk less about alopecia, but in terms of a cosmetic procedure, hair transplantation is the most common cosmetic procedure performed on men today. And it doesn't have to be like on your scalp because, for example, male to female transgender patients will often have eyebrow, eyelash, or even pubic hair transplantation. So, you do see that. Interesting history.
Pubic hair transplantation? Like putting in pubic hair?
Apparently.
Like people want it?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's an episode if I ever saw one. Okay.
Yeah. I think it put it, I guess, I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting. So one interesting historical fact about hair transplantation is actually started in Japan in the 1930s, where if someone had damaged, areas like their eyebrows or lashes, they never used it for baldness, but they would do like these grafts of hair transplants. But their efforts didn't receive a lot of attention because, of course, after the 1930s was the 1940s and World War II. And so a lot of the research from the Japanese community was kind of discounted and not really valued. And then it was only later on that the hair transplants.
Classic Western arrogance. Yeah.
So I think to talk about how hair transplants work, Ali, let's talk about hairs themselves. Okay. So our head, a head like mine contains approximately 100.
Stop being so smug. Why are you smug? Why are you smirking? Stop it.
Contains about 100,000 hairs. And people will lose about 30% of that number from adolescence to middle age. That's normal, okay? But for thinning to be cosmetically noticeable, you need to have at least 50% of your hairs to have fallen out, okay? And Ali, when did you first start noticing your hair loss?
Probably age 20 or 21, maybe. It might have been 21. I was on a bus going to a cabane à sucre, which is a sugar shack. And it was a bunch of us and people were taking pictures in the bus and on the trip. And in the bus, I was bent down talking to some people who were sitting and I was standing on the bus. And somebody took a picture and I saw for the first time the back of my head. And I was like, that's very white scalp, and that's very noticeable. What's going on there? And then I think within a few months of that, I shaved my head for the first time, and then that just started that. I think I grew it out once, but then kept.
You were one of the early adopters in terms of people I know who shave their head. They're like, I'm just doing this, so which is good because people again, depending on your age, people like now most people who are bald shave their head. I would say the vast majority of people who are balding or do that. Maybe not everyone, but a lot of people do. But that was not a popular thing to do back in.
No. One of my uncles asked me if I was a skinhead now. That was back in those days. I remember one of my friends, somebody who you know as well, Asif, a Marine, saw me and screamed out loud on campus when she saw my shaved head. She screamed out loud as though I was wearing a killer's mask with yielding a blood, a knife dripping with blood. So it was not an easy time, but luckily my head is not too misshaped, right? There's also those people who they've got too many bumps and nooks and crannies. They just can't shave their head.
You got a nice cranium there, buddy. By the way, Ali, curious about this in your family. There's some reports, these are mainly anecdotal though, where there's a stronger link to the maternal side of the family to the paternal side. So if your mother's side has more baldness, more likely. Was that in your family?
Oh, yeah. I'm like a carbon copy of my maternal grandfather. We are both, there's some side profiles of that man, like bald eagle. This just completely slick up top early on in his life too. So yeah, that man, he was the father of modern prose poetry in Pakistan. His name was N.M. Rashid. So maybe he passed along the gift of sort of, being somebody who was good with words
Yeah, and also
but then I got this gift
yes,
as well.
exactly. Yeah, Ali's grandfather, extremely famous poet. But let's get back to a question that you may have, Ali, which is why exactly does baldness occur?
Why?
So
Why?
this is an interesting story. So basically, to get baldness, you require a hormone called dihydrotestosterone to link to hair follicles. Okay. Now you can imagine dihydrotestosterone is converted from testosterone, okay? And you need an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase to create this conversion, okay? And then this conversion takes place in the bloodstream, and basically it will cause miniaturization of the hair and hair follicles, and then it leads to follicle death, okay? So one question might be, why do people who go bald going to go bald at the top and the sides, but the back of their head is relatively spared? Right? And that's
like just above the neck, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Like that back? Yes.
And this is because the area in the back of the head they don't have a lot of this enzyme, 5-alpha reductase. So they have either zero or very little of that enzyme. So you don't get the same hair loss in that area of the scalp as opposed to other areas. Okay? And so that's the reason why that area, those follicles will stay intact often in people who go bald. And of course, Ali, there is this Norwood classification syndrome for baldness, which it's in our Google Doc. You can scroll down and take a look at it. There's 7 different categories, and there's a little picture here about the different types of baldness that Ali can take a look.
Will you be sharing that with our listeners?
Yes, I will also tweet that out associated with our Instagram account. And of course, women may be different. They may not get this kind of male pattern. They might get more thinning.
We're definitely, I think we're jumping ahead to hair transplants, right? Because when you first start losing hair, if you go see a doctor about it, I don't think they go right to transplant. They'd go to the Rogaine world and the Propecia world, right?
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about those. Good point. And of course, your doctor will also maybe look, especially if you're very young when you start, or if you're a female, then they may look for other causes. So thyroid problems in women, PCOS, which we talked about before, anemia due to low iron, and other dermatologic issues might cause that. But there are drugs, and so one of them is minoxidil, which is Rogaine, and you need to apply it directly to the scalp for those areas that are undergoing hair loss. And it was actually a treatment for blood pressure initially, that they noticed that this is an effect you can have. So basically, you can buy these at the pharmacy. Sometimes you need a prescription, and it helps about 20 to 40% of people retain their hair and sometimes achieve hair regrowth. So one way that some people say this is it prevents further hair loss. It may help to stabilize things. Interestingly, some doctors recommend you use this after hair transplantation to help with that after the procedure. Then there's also Propecia. So this goes back to the enzyme we were talking about. This is a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. So it blocks the conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, which we abbreviate DHT. So it blocks this conversion to DHT. So that makes sense, right? You block it then so of course this will prevent the miniaturization and the death of the
eventual death. Yeah.
So again, it can stop hair loss and maybe cause potential of regrowth of hair, but that's more in the back where the enzyme was less active anyway. So again, if you're starting to notice hair loss and you want to pause it, maybe that's when you'd want to look at some of these things.
We should add that some of these drugs also have side effects, most notably and memorably a reduced sex drive. I think libido was one of the victims, the innocent victims in all of this, which is what keeps some people from...
Right, exactly.
Because now I have a whole head of hair, but I have no interest in sharing the rest of my body with somebody else. Feels like
exactly. And for the Rogaine, the side effects are often heart palpitations and headache. And again, both of these side effects have to do with the way these two different drugs work. So again, so maybe you can pause or delay things with the medicine, but if you've already lost your hair, then you may want to look at this hair transplant. And so maybe we'll talk a bit about the different kinds. There's the way it used to be done with what's called a follicular unit strip surgery. So you go to the back part of the head. Did you know this, Ollie, that this is where the hair transplants occur, from the back part of the head, like, because these hair follicles don't have a lot of this enzyme? Were you aware of this before we
I
started this
was,
topic?
man. There was a manager I had I worked at a large, big box electronics store called Future Shop. Some people might remember Future Shop. And our manager was getting exactly that. So you saw missing strips out of the back of his head, and you saw new hair, quote unquote, growth on the front of his head. So yeah, it was being removed from
Mm-hmm.
there.
So
The chunks and
he
that.
wasn't like, he was open about this, or?
He couldn't not be. I mean, he was a weird guy. You couldn't sort of have honest conversations with him anyway, but he wasn't wearing a hat. He was out there
Yeah,
with a
yeah.
suit on the sales floor, and
Yeah.
everyone could see what was happening.
Well, yeah, so this is the way it was done, especially in the past, probably around the time you would have been seeing this guy do it. So they take a 6 to 10 inch strip of skin from the back of your head, so pretty big. They set it aside, sew the scalp closed, and then they divide the strip. And it's a surgeon, but they'll have like 6 to 8 people working with them in their clinic for this. Surgeon divides the strip into about 500 to 2,000 little tiny grafts, each with just a few hairs or just one hair, and then they transplant those to the frontal part of your head. And then there's another type of procedure, which is now used in the vast majority of patients, from my understanding, is this follicular unit extraction. Okay, so if you're getting this, they'll shave the back of your scalp, and then they remove the hair follicles one by one, and then you basically will just have these little tiny dots, like kind of red dots at the back of your head that your existing hair will usually cover. And then basically they're harvesting these little hair follicles, and then they clean and numb the area on the front, and they create little holes, a hole or a little slit, a very tiny slit, like with a scalpel or a needle, and they very delicately, ever so gently, place these hair follicles into these holes that they've done. And again, there's a team of people kind of preparing and giving these to the surgeon. And the reason why people like this follicular unit extraction is because it looks a lot more natural. You don't need large areas of scalp to be excised, like you said, this person that you knew. You don't have a scar, and then you may have these small punctate scars, but they're covered with your hair, so you don't need to do it. And so the whole process takes about 4 to 8 hours. And what's very interesting is that the hair follicles grow immediately in the postoperative phase, but then they enter what's called the telogen phase, and then all the hairs fall out again. So that could, I'm sure, have to prepare people for that, because that would be pretty upsetting. And then the hair regrows again, and that takes about 4 months, and then becomes more and more of better quality and quantity in the subsequent months after that. So if you have an experienced surgeon, after about a year, you have graft survival rates of about 95%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it tends to work quite well.
And this would not be something that would be covered by any insurance program,
Not as
right? This
far as
is,
I'm aware of. Yeah.
yeah. What is the cost of this to
Yeah,
the
exactly.
average person?
So it costs about $4,000 to $15,000 in the U.S., maybe up to $21,000 in Alberta and British Columbia. The websites I said, make sure to apply the tax wherever you live. So HST is applied in some places in Canada, just GST in some places, QST in Quebec. So it's surprisingly not as much as I thought it would be. I really had no idea how much it would be. And
Right.
some people certainly go overseas to other
Yes.
countries.
Which country
to
comes
do.
to mind to you? Which country?
I believe it's Turkey, but
It is Turkey, man. Turkey's the spot.
Yeah,
Turkey is, you go have some delicious kebabs, you visit some beautiful mosques, and then you go get a hair transplant. This is like a very common thing, especially from people who are closer to Turkey in the Middle East or in India, Pakistan. Turkey is a destination, and people go on hair transplant trips together.
And again, like, it's a day, basically 48 hours, not even half a day. And so it seems relatively straightforward. Now, you need to have a sedation for it, sometimes oral sedation, sometimes just a local anesthetic. So, okay, there could be complications from that. Side effects, scarring, infection, which is called folliculitis, Some people, we can do a whole episode on this, can develop keloid scars. These are people who develop very big scars after any sort of thing, surgery or incisions, and that would obviously be bad. And then, of course, bleeding and other kinds of infections. So, relatively well tolerated. If you were to see somebody, I would just want to make sure that they know what they're doing. And of course, that they have low complication rates, especially if you're going to be looking overseas. The other thing I would say is things have changed a lot with hair transplantation over time. I think the old days of people, they got hair plugs and it's really obvious. This is, again, what you're talking about when you were working at Future Shop, like maybe like whatever that was, 25, 30 years ago. I think technology has really changed. It looks quite natural now. And they, of course, style things in a certain way where there's not like an abrupt start. They make it look like a natural hairline with often a widow's peak and then not maybe a straight contour, right? Maybe a bit more wavy, irregular contour like normal hair looks like. So basically what I'm saying is, Ali, have you saved up 15
I have
to
not
20,000?
saved up. You know what? At this point, my ship has sailed.
Oh, yeah.
Here's what happened. There was like this 15-year period where I was like, I would do anything to get my hair back. And then you read about Rogaine and the side effects. Okay, not that. But I would do anything. And then they say Propecia, but then, okay, your libido. Okay, I don't want that. And then you see somebody have a hair transplant. You're like, I don't want that. That looks like it's carpet stapled to your scalp. That doesn't look good. That's going to look worse than what I'm going through right now. I think now we're in a point where it could make sense, but at my age, what am I talking about? But I am like, my 9-year-old son has exactly the hair I had. If that guy doesn't go bald, I'll be shocked. But it's crazy to me that he will still, in 10 to 15 years from now, not have just somebody goes, oh yeah, use this oil. It'll help your hair grow back. Like, I just cannot for the life of me believe it's not that simple.
And again, maybe it will be as we're developing more and better drugs for all things. And of course, there's a huge industry, right? If it's 60% of men have baldness.
Yeah, big hair. Big hair doesn't want a simple oil that is extracted from a tree in South America to come out on the market. Listen, man, if there was ever a conspiracy in my mind, it's got to be this. How can there not be? Come on, people. Wake up. Wake up,
key
everyone.
Statement is in your mind.
It is in my mind.
That's our episode for today. Let us know what you guys thought. Again, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, probably not going to talk a bit more about the art versus the artist, unless a new documentary or some new allegations come up against somebody, then we might, but we've talked about this. So definitely check out all of these episodes again. We have one, which is separating the art from the artist, Michael Jackson, Louis C.K. I think if you listen to all three of those, you get a very well-rounded examination of this difficult subject. And of course, hair transplants, let us know what you guys think. You guys know anybody who's had a hair transplant? Again, you may not, because nowadays they look so good, you can hardly tell in a lot of people. So let us know what you guys thought about this episode. drvcomedian@gmail.com, drvcomedian on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are everywhere. Ali, you got hernia surgery coming up?
Sure do.
That
should be fun. And then, I'll be doing a comedy special in September in Toronto. And then I'm touring around Ontario, coming to Ottawa and Montreal with my friends John Doerr and Dave Merhej on a Sirius XM Comedy Here Often collab tour. And it should be a very good time.
Yeah, that sounds great.
We got a friend of ours, Ali Pierce, who's an opening comic. And then those two will share the bill. It'll be wonderful.
Sounds great. But remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye.